Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A knock in the quiet. Betty Thompson had always found solace in her garden. At 82 years old, she was no stranger to solitude, yet her flowers, with their vibrant blooms and delicate fragrances, gave her a sense of purpose. They were her companions, especially since George, her husband of 50 years, had passed away. The rhythmic snip of her pruning shears filled the air, blending with the gentle hum of bees and the rustling of leaves. Betty glanced up briefly, wiping her brow with a gloved hand, her eyes wandering to the empty house next door. It had been vacant for over a year now, its once pristine exterior showing signs of neglect. The faded "For Sale" sign leaned awkwardly to one side, as if tired of standing guard over a place no one seemed to want. This street used to hum with life, children's laughter, barbecues, neighbors chatting over fences. Now, it was a shadow of its former self. Most of the original families had moved away, replaced by strangers who kept to themselves. Betty was the last remnant of a time when community truly meant something. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low rumble in the distance. Straightening up, she shaded her eyes against the sun and peered down the road. A large moving truck crawled into view, its brakes squealing softly as it pulled to a stop in front of the empty house. Betty's heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and curiosity. New neighbors. Betty set her shears aside, pretending to busy herself with a stubborn weed as she observed the newcomers. A woman in her early 30s stepped out of the truck first. Her dark skin glowed in the sunlight, and she wore a simple, flowing dress that swayed gently in the breeze. Her expression was a mix of hope and hesitation, as though she wasn't sure what to expect. Two little girls followed closely behind her, their hands clutching the hem of her dress. They were twins, unmistakably so, with matching curls that bounced as they hopped down from the truck. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Their wide, curious eyes darted around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Betty's lips curved into a smile at the sight of them. It had been so long since the sound of children had graced this street. But then a man emerged from the driver's side of the truck. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair that caught the light. His rugged appearance was in stark contrast to the woman's refined elegance. Betty frowned slightly. Something about the dynamic felt off. The man's gaze was sharp, almost calculating, as he surveyed the neighborhood. Betty's musings were interrupted when the woman turned her head and caught her eye. For a moment, their gazes locked, and a warm smile spread across the woman's face. Instinctively, Betty raised her hand in a wave. It was a small gesture, but it carried with it the hope of connection, of new beginnings. As the truck unloaded only a few suitcases and a single piece of furniture, Betty's curiosity deepened. Most families arrived with their lives packed into boxes. This family seemed to have brought only the bare essentials. Betty decided to give them space, reasoning that they'd need time to settle in. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she found herself glancing at their house one last time before retreating indoors. That evening, Betty sat in her favorite armchair, a steaming cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. The soft glow of the television played against the walls, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this family than met the eye. The street was unusually quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her. It was a comforting sound, one that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone in the world. Still, a strange sense of anticipation settled over her, like the moment before a storm breaks. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint knock at the door. Betty froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was rare for anyone to visit, especially at this hour. Setting her teacup down, she rose slowly, her joints protesting with each step. Peeking through the window, Betty's breath caught. Standing on her porch were the two little girls from earlier. Their small frames were illuminated by the warm glow of her porch light, their faces pale with a worry no child should ever know. Betty opened the door cautiously, her voice gentle. "Hello there, sweethearts. Are you lost?" The girls exchanged nervous glances before one of them, clutching a stuffed rabbit, took a tentative step forward. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "We need help." Betty's heart ached at the fear in the child's eyes. "Come in," she said without hesitation, stepping aside to let them in. As they entered, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She had no idea that this single act of kindness would unravel a chain of events that would change her life forever. Secrets unfold in the glow of the hearth. The twins hesitated at the threshold, their small hands clutching one another tightly. Their wide, fearful eyes darted around Betty's modest living room as though expecting danger to emerge from the shadows. Betty, her own heart heavy with concern, gently urged them inside and closed the door behind them. The cozy warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the cold, night air outside. The soft crackle of the fireplace, the faint aroma of chamomile tea, and the glow of the antique lamps made the space feel safe. At least, that was Betty's hope. "Come, sit down," Betty said softly, gesturing to the well-worn sofa near the fire. The girls exchanged a glance before shuffling over and perching on the edge of the sofa, their small bodies tense. Betty knelt slowly in front of them, her arthritic knees protesting the movement, but she pushed through the discomfort. She needed to be on their level, to make them feel less intimidated. "I'm Betty," she said, her voice as warm as the hearth. "What are your names?" The girl with the stuffed rabbit looked to her sister as though seeking permission. After a hesitant nod, she whispered, "I'm Mia, and this is my sister, Nia." "Well, it's lovely to meet you both," Betty said with a gentle smile. "Now, can you tell me why you're out so late? Does your mommy know you're here?" At the mention of their mother, Mia's lower lip quivered, and Nia's small hands clenched into fists around the hem of her dress. Betty's smile faltered as unease prickled at her. "We didn't know where else to go," Nia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mommy told us to stay quiet, but," she trailed off, tears brimming in her eyes. Betty reached out instinctively, placing a comforting hand on Nia's knee. "It's all right, darling. You're safe here. Take your time." Mia squeezed her rabbit tighter and whispered, "Mommy's hurt. She's not waking up." The words sent a chill through Betty's veins. Her mind raced. "What do you mean, she's not waking up?" Nia, her voice trembling, added, "She's on the floor in the kitchen. We tried to wake her, but she didn't move." Betty inhaled sharply, her years of life experience telling her this was serious. The urge to act surged through her, but she kept her composure for the girl's sake. "Where is your house?" Betty asked. "Next door," Mia replied, her voice so soft Betty had to strain to hear her. The revelation made Betty's heart sink further. They were so close, yet no one had heard their cries for help. "All right," Betty said firmly, rising to her feet. "You two stay right here. I'll grab my coat, and we'll go check on your mommy together." Outside, the crisp night air bit at Betty's face as she held each girl's hand tightly. The three of them crossed the small lawn separating her house from theirs. Betty's mind was a whirlwind of concern and questions. Why hadn't the man from earlier helped? Where was he now? The twins led Betty to the back door, which they had left slightly ajar. She pushed it open to find a dimly lit kitchen, the light from a single bulb casting eerie shadows on the walls. And there she was. The twins' mother lay crumpled on the linoleum floor, her body unnaturally still. A shallow pool of water surrounded her, as if she'd dropped something before collapsing. Betty hurried over, her old knees protesting every step, and knelt beside the woman. "Call 911, Betty said urgently to Nia, pointing to the cordless phone on the counter. The girl hesitated but quickly obeyed, standing on her tiptoes to reach the phone. Meanwhile, Betty checked for signs of life. The woman's breathing was faint but steady, and her pulse was weak. Relief washed over Betty, she was alive, but barely. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed in, taking over as Betty held the twins close. She whispered soothing words to them, though she could feel their small bodies trembling against her. One of the paramedics, a young man with kind eyes, approached Betty after assessing the situation. "She's severely dehydrated and malnourished," he said quietly, glancing at the twins. "It looks like she's been under a lot of stress for a long time. Do you know her?" "No," Betty admitted, her voice heavy with guilt for not having reached out sooner. "They just moved in today." The paramedic nodded, his expression grim. "We'll take her to the hospital. But, someone will need to look after the girls." Betty didn't hesitate. "They'll stay with me," she said firmly, her gaze softening as she looked down at the twins. Later that night, back in her own home, Betty tucked the girls into her spare bed. The weight of the evening pressed heavily on her shoulders as she watched them drift into a fitful sleep, their small hands still clasped tightly together. Sitting by the window, Betty stared out at the darkened street, her mind racing. Who was this family? What had brought them to this point? And where was the man she had seen earlier? A knock at her door startled her. Rising cautiously, she opened it to find the man from the moving truck standing there. His face was unreadable in the dim light, but his presence sent a shiver down her spine. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice low and menacing. Betty's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "If you mean those girls, they belong with someone who'll keep them safe. And from where I'm standing, that's not you." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Betty thought he might lash out. But then he stepped back, his expression twisting into a cruel smirk. "This isn't over," he said before disappearing into the night. Betty closed the door, her hands trembling. Whatever nightmare this family was running from, it had just arrived at her doorstep. Shadows of the past. Betty double-locked her door, her hands trembling as she slid the chain into place. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood, her heart racing. The man's parting words echoed in her mind, "This isn't over." Turning away from the door, Betty cast a worried glance toward the small bedroom where Mia and Nia slept. Their soft breathing was the only sound in the quiet house, but the man's presence outside had shifted the atmosphere. It felt as though a storm had settled over her once peaceful home. Betty made her way to the living room and sat heavily in her armchair. Her gaze fell on the untouched cup of tea she'd abandoned earlier. Picking it up, she took a sip, hoping the familiar warmth would calm her nerves. But her thoughts raced relentlessly. Who was that man? He didn't act like someone who cared about the twins or their mother. His cold, menacing demeanor suggested something darker. And what had he meant by "this isn't over"? Betty resolved to call the police in the morning. She didn't have enough information to explain the situation fully, but the man's threat had been clear. She couldn't let her guard down, not with the twins under her care. The following day, Betty woke to the sound of soft giggles. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window cast a warm glow over the room, momentarily dispelling the tension from the previous night. Mia and Nia sat at the table, swinging their legs as they spooned cereal from mismatched bowls. Betty smiled at the sight, though her heart ached, knowing their mother was still in the hospital. "Good morning, dears," she said, her voice gentle. "Did you sleep well?" The twins nodded in unison. "Thank you for letting us stay," Mia said, her voice shy but sincere. Betty placed a hand over her chest, touched by their gratitude. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. Now, eat up. We have a busy day ahead." The girls exchanged a curious glance, but didn't ask questions. Betty had made up her mind to learn more about their situation, and that meant going straight to the source. At the hospital, Betty sat beside the twins' mother, who looked frail but conscious. Her name was Alana, and though her voice was weak, her gratitude was palpable. "Thank you for taking care of my girls," Alana said, her eyes welling with tears. "I didn't know who else to trust." "They're lovely children," Betty replied, her voice firm with kindness. "But Alana, you need to tell me what's going on. Who was that man at my door last night? And why does he think those girls don't belong with you?" Alana's face paled, and she looked away, staring at the ceiling as though searching for the right words. "He's not their father," she said finally. "His name is Rick. He was my boyfriend for a while." But things changed when he realized I didn't have much to my name. He started controlling everything, where I went, who I talked to, even how I raised the girls. Betty felt a chill run down her spine. And now? Alana's voice cracked as she continued. When I finally stood up to him and told him to leave, he threatened to take the girls. He said I wasn't capable of raising them without him. That's why I moved here, to get away from him. But I guess he found us. Betty's jaw tightened. She had seen her share of injustice in her long life, but there was something particularly cruel about a man using fear to manipulate and control. What does he want? Betty asked, her voice low. Alana swallowed hard. Power. He thinks if he takes the girls, I'll come crawling back to him. He doesn't care about them, he just wants to hurt me. Betty reached over and took Alana's hand. You're not alone in this. We'll protect those girls. I promise you that. Later that afternoon, Betty returned home with the twins. Her mind was already working on a plan. She contacted the local police, who promised to increase patrols in the area, and she made arrangements with a family lawyer she had known for years. But as the days passed, Betty couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and she often felt a prickle at the back of her neck, as though someone were just out of sight. One evening, as she was locking up, she heard a faint noise outside, a rustle of leaves, followed by the crunch of gravel. Betty's heart leaped into her throat. Grabbing her flashlight, she stepped onto the porch, her hand steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Who's there? She called out, her voice firm. Silence. But then she spotted something at the edge of her lawn, a small piece of paper fluttering in the wind. Betty stepped down and picked it up. The words scrawled across the page made her blood run cold. You can't hide them forever. She looked around, her eyes scanning the darkness, but saw no one. Clutching the note, she hurried back inside and bolted the door. The next day, Betty shared the note with the police, but there was little they could do without direct evidence. It was up to her to protect the twins, and she was determined not to fail them. She spent hours talking to Alana on the phone, coordinating with lawyers and counselors. Slowly, a picture of Rick's behavior emerged, a man driven by control and manipulation, someone who thrived on fear. But Betty was no stranger to standing up to bullies. George had always said she had a spine of steel beneath her kind demeanor, and now she was prepared to prove it. She enrolled the twins in a local school and made sure they were never alone, walking them to and from class each day. She strengthened the locks on her doors and installed motion sensor lights around her house. But the most important weapon she had was love. Betty showered Mia and Nia with the warmth and stability they desperately needed, building a safe haven for them to heal. Still, the shadow of Rick loomed over them all, and Betty knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to strike again. A reckoning in the quiet night. Weeks passed, and the initial shock of that ominous note had dulled, though the undercurrent of fear remained. Betty kept the twins close, shielding them with love and vigilance. Her house had become their sanctuary, a place filled with bedtime stories, warm meals, and whispered prayers of safety. Yet Betty knew the storm was not over. Rick was still out there, lurking like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Betty had seen men like him before in her long life, bullies who thrived on control. But Betty was made of sterner stuff, and she had no intention of letting Rick win. It was a calm evening when the confrontation finally came. Betty had just finished tucking Mia and Nia into bed. The girls were laughing over a story she'd told about George's clumsy attempt at building a treehouse decades ago, their giggles a balm to her weary heart. As she closed their door, her own smile lingered until she heard it, the unmistakable crunch of gravel in her driveway. Betty froze, her ears straining. Someone was outside. Her breath caught, but instead of panic, a sense of grim determination settled over her. She grabbed the small can of pepper spray she now kept in her pocket and moved quietly to the front window. Peering through the lace curtains, she saw a figure standing by the motion sensor light, its glow illuminating the unmistakable face of Rick. Betty's hand tightened on the spray. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she would not let him take the girls. Rick moved toward the front door, his movements slow and deliberate. Betty stepped back, willing herself to stay calm. She locked the door and braced herself, knowing he would try to force his way in. "Betty!" Rick's voice cut through the quiet night, low and menacing. "I know you're in there. Open up, and we'll make this easy." Betty didn't answer. "I just want the girls," he called out, his tone laced with false charm. "They're mine, and you know it." She swallowed the surge of anger his words provoked. Taking a deep breath, she called back, her voice steady, "They're not yours, Rick. You have no claim to them." Silence followed. Then came the sound of a loud bang as Rick pounded on the door. Betty flinched, but held her ground. "You're making a mistake, old woman," Rick shouted. "I'll break this door down if I have to." Betty's mind raced. She knew the police were on heightened alert, and she had a direct line to the station. Moving quickly, she grabbed her phone and dialed. "This is Betty Thompson at 314 Maple Street," she whispered into the receiver. "The man I told you about is here. He's trying to break in." The dispatcher's calm voice reassured her that officers were on their way. Betty set the phone down and turned back to the door, her resolve hardening. The next moments felt like hours. Rick banged on the door again, harder this time, rattling the frame. Betty could hear his muttered curses as he worked to pry open the lock. Then, he succeeded. The door burst open with a deafening crack, and Rick stepped inside. His eyes were wild, his presence filling the room like a dark cloud. Betty stood her ground, her small frame seeming impossibly steady against the storm that had just entered. "Where are they?" Rick demanded, his voice a low growl. Betty didn't flinch. "They're safe. And you won't touch them." Rick sneered, stepping closer. "You're brave for someone so old. But you don't scare me." Betty's lips tightened. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and cutting. "You don't scare me, either. I've seen men like you before, cowards who think they can take whatever they want. But you've underestimated the wrong woman." Rick lunged, but Betty was faster than he expected. She raised the pepper spray and aimed directly at his face. The spray hit its mark, and Rick staggered back, clutching his eyes and howling in pain. Betty didn't wait. She grabbed the twins, who had awakened and were peeking around the corner, and hustled them into the pantry. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice firm but kind. "Don't come out until I say so." The sound of sirens pierced the night air moments later, their wail both a warning and a promise. Rick, still stumbling and blinded, cursed and fumbled toward the door. But before he could escape, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, followed by the commanding voice of a police officer. "Stop right there. Hands where we can see them." Rick froze, his hands raised in defeat. Officers swarmed the house, and within moments, he was handcuffed and led away, his protests drowned out by the chaos. Betty emerged from the pantry, pulling the twins into her arms as the officers assured her the danger was over. The girls clung to her, their small bodies trembling, but Betty's embrace was strong and unyielding. The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with news of what had happened. Betty, despite her exhaustion, stood in her garden, watching as the girls played nearby. Alana had been released from the hospital, and together, they were piecing their lives back together. "Thank you," Alana said softly, coming to stand beside Betty. Betty smiled, her gaze never leaving the twins. "They're worth it," she said simply. The weight of the past weeks lifted as the sound of laughter filled the air. For the first time in years, Betty felt a sense of peace, knowing that her actions had made a difference, not just for the girls, but for the neighborhood she had long called home.